Chapter 40 of the Adventures of Ferdinand Count Fathom by Tobias Smollett. This Librivox Recording is in the public domain. This expedition being happily finished, General Macleaver put the whole army, navy, transports, and scene of action into a canvas bag. The prince unsaddled his nose, and Captain Minikin being admitted, our hero was introduced in form. Very gracious was the reception he met with from his majesty, who, with a most princely demeanour, welcomed him to court, and even seated him on his right hand, in token of particular regard. True it is, this presence chamber was not so superb, nor the appearance of the king so magnificent, as to render such an honour intoxicating to any person of our hero's coolness and discretion. In lieu of tapestry, the apartment was hung with halfpenny ballads. A truckle bed without curtains supplied the place of a canopy, and instead of a crown, his majesty wore a woollen nightcap. Yet, in spite of these disadvantages, there was an air of dignity in his deportment, and a nice physiognomist would have perceived something majestic in the features of his countenance. He was certainly a personage of very prepossessing mien. His manners were engaging, his conversation agreeable, and any man whose heart was subject to the meltings of humanity would have deplored his distress, and looked upon him as a most pathetic instance of that miserable reverse to which all human grandeur is exposed. His fall was even greater than that of Belisarius, who, after having obtained many glorious victories over the enemies of his country, is said to have been reduced to such extremity of indigence, that in his old age, when he was deprived of his eyesight, he sat upon the highway like a common mendicant, imploring the charity of passengers in the piteous exclamation of Date obulum Belisario, that is, spare a farthing to your poor old soldier Belisarius. I say this general's disgrace was not so remarkable as that of Theodore, because he was the servant of Justinian, consequently his fortune depended upon the nod of that emperor, whereas the other actually possessed the throne of sovereignty by the best of all titles, namely, the unanimous election of the whole people over whom he reigned, and attracted the eyes of all Europe by the efforts he made in breaking the bands of oppression, and vindicating that liberty which is the birthright of man. The English of former days, alike renowned for generosity and valour, treated those hostile princes, whose fate it was to wear their chains with such delicacy of benevolence, as ever dispelled the horrors of captivity. But their posterity of this refined age feel no compunction at seeing an unfortunate monarch, their former friend, ally, and partisan, languish amidst the miseries of a loathsome jail, for a paltry debt contracted in their own service. But, moralizing apart, our hero had not long conversed with this extraordinary debtor, who in his present condition assumed no other title than that of baron, that he perceived in him a spirit of quixotism, which all his experience, together with the vicissitudes of his fortune, had not been able to overcome. Not that his ideas soared to such a pitch of extravagant hope as that which took possession of his messmates, who frequently quarrelled one with another about the degrees of favour to which they should be entitled after the king's restoration; but he firmly believed that affairs would speedily take such a turn in Italy as would point out to the English court the expediency of employing him again, and his persuasion seemed to support him against every species of poverty and mortification. While they were busy in trimming the balance of power on the other side of the Alps, their deliberations were interrupted by the arrival of a scullion, who came to receive their orders touching the bill of fare for dinner, and his majesty found much more difficulty in settling this important concern than in compromising all the differences between the emperor and the Queen of Spain. At length, however, General Macleaver undertook the office of purveyor for his prince. Captain Minikin insisted upon treating the count, and in a little time the table was covered with a cloth, which, for the sake of my delicate readers, I will not attempt to describe. At this period they were joined by Sir Mungo Barebones, who, having found means to purchase a couple of mutton chops, had cooked a mess of broth, which he now brought in a saucepan to the general rendezvous. This was the most remarkable object which had hitherto presented itself to the eyes of Fathom. Being naturally of a meagre habit, he was, by indigence and hard study, wore almost to the bone, and so bended towards the earth, that in walking his body described at least 150 degrees of a circle. The want of stockings and shoes he supplied with a jockey's straight boot and a half jack. His thighs and middle were cased in a monstrous pair of brown trunk breeches, which the keeper bought for his use from the executor of a Dutch seaman who had lately died in the jail. His shirt retained no signs of its original colour. His body was shrouded in an old, greasy, tattered plaid nightgown. A blue and white handkerchief surrounded his head, and his looks betokened that immense load of care which he had voluntarily incurred for the eternal salvation of sinners. Yet this figure, uncouth as it was, made his compliments to our adventurer in terms of the most elegant address, and, in the course of conversation, disclosed a great fund of valuable knowledge. He had appeared in the great world, and borne divers offices of dignity and trust with universal applause. His courage was undoubted, his morals were unimpeached, and his person held in great veneration and esteem. When his evil genius engaged him in the study of Hebrew, and the mysteries of the Jewish religion, which fairly disordered his brain, and rendered him incapable of managing his temporal affairs. When he ought to have been employed in the functions of his post, he was always wrapped in visionary conferences with Moses on the Mount. Rather than regulate the economy of his household, he chose to exert his endeavours in settling the precise meaning of the word Elohim, and having discovered that now the period was come when the Jews and Gentiles would be converted, he postponed every other consideration in order to facilitate that great and glorious event. By this time Ferdinand had seen every member of the club, except the French chevalier, who seemed to be quite neglected by the society, for his name was not once mentioned during this communication, and they sat down to dinner without asking whether he was dead or alive. The king regaled himself with a plate of ox cheek. The major, who complained that his appetite had forsaken him, amused himself with some 40 hard eggs, malaxed with salt butter. The knight indulged upon his soup and bouilli, and the captain entertained our adventurer with a neck of veal roasted with potatoes. But before Fathom could make use of his knife and fork, he was summoned to the door, where he found the chevalier in great agitation, his eyes sparkling like coals of fire. Our hero was not a little surprised at this apparition, who, having asked pardon for the freedom he had used, observed that, understanding the Count was a foreigner, he could not dispense with appealing to him concerning an outrage he had suffered from the keeper, who, without any regard to his rank or misfortunes, had been base enough to refuse him credit for a few necessaries, until he could have a remittance from his steward in France. He therefore conjured Count Fathom, as a stranger and nobleman like himself, to be the messenger of defiance, which he resolved to send to that brutal jailer, that, for the future, he might learn to make proper distinctions in the exercise of his function. Fathom, who had no inclination to offend this choleric Frenchman, assured him that he might depend upon his friendship, and in the meantime prevailed upon him to accept of a small supply, in consequence of which he procured a pound of sausages, and joined the rest of the company without delay, making a very suitable addition to such an assemblage of rarities. Though his age did not exceed 30 years, his beard, which was of a brindled hue, flowed down, like Aaron's, to his middle. Upon his legs he wore red stockings rolled up over the joint of the knee. His breeches were of blue drab, with vellum buttonholes, and garters of gold lace, his waistcoat of scarlet, his coat of rusty black cloth, his hair, twisted into a ramillie, hung down to his rump, of the colour of jet, and his hat was adorned with a white feather. This original had formed many ingenious schemes to increase the glory and grandeur of France, but was discouraged by Cardinal Fleury, who, in all appearance, jealous of his great talents, not only rejected his projects, but even sent him to prison, on pretence of being offended at his impertinence. Perceiving that, like the prophet, he had no honour in his own country, he no sooner obtained his release than he retired to England, where he was prompted by his philanthropy to propose an expedient to our ministry, which would have saved a vast effusion of blood and treasure. This was an agreement between the Queen of Hungary and the late Emperor, to decide their pretensions by a single combat, in which case he offered himself as the Bavarian champion. But in this endeavour he also proved unsuccessful. Then, turning his attention to the delights of poetry, he became so enamoured of the muse, that he neglected every other consideration, and she, as usual, gradually conducted him to the author's never-failing goal, a place of rest appointed for all those sinners whom the profane love of poetry hath led astray. Chapter 40.